brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that sends 5% of your monthly plan price to your favorite charity. No contracts, nationwide coverage, risk-free guarantee. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
Today I have for you Fulton Sheen, which is an unusual choice for a Saturday. But what makes this even more unusual is this is actually a book review that he wrote. He's reviewing a book by an atheist philosopher who basically says that religion is basically gone and that tradition is dead and science is the way forward. Progress. And given that this was written in like the 1950s, it sounds very, very familiar to us because that is what we hear all the time from the fedora tippers on social media who try to tell us that, who scoff at the notion that Christ is king or at the very existence of God himself. So this is Fulton Sheen just taking apart this argument. And when he gets dense in some of his arguments, he then gives examples that are pretty easy to follow to illustrate the dense statements he made. So I don't have to explain any of those dense statements because he then explains them for you, at least what I thought to be dense. Let me know what you thought of this at the end. Is Religion Growing Up by Fulton Sheen. Sir Isaac Newton was the supreme proof that a man may be a very good mathematician and yet a very poor theologian. Professor Roy Wood Sellers of the University of Michigan, in his latest book, Religion Coming of Age, is almost the supreme example that a man may be a very good philosopher of realism and yet a very poor philosopher of religion. This book, whose name is Legion, puts forward an idea which goes so often unchallenged that it has become almost a dogma. Vis-a-vis the new backgrounds of science and progress have antiquated not only supernatural religion, but also a belief in God, and made imperative a religion without God, or better still, a religion whose fundamental query is the cosmos friendly? The proofs of the existence of God are considered worthless, mostly on the ground of authority, namely the infallible authority of Kant and Hume. In adding his own testimony to these philosophers, the author says, quoting him directly, "The second great traditional argument in natural theology was the so-called cosmological argument to a first cause. It is this that St. Thomas stresses. We need not linger upon it because we have already argued that science and philosophy no longer tend to assume a first cause. Why assume an absolute beginning for reality? If change is an event in nature, may not both change and nature always have been? And in our human minds, we can go back in thought from effect to cause indefinitely. An indefinite series is quite thinkable, and any stoppage would be a matter of arbitrary fiat. Neither science nor philosophy then assumes any absolute beginning for reality. May we say that the second argument of traditional philosophy, or of St. Thomas, is not the cosmological argument? Many a supposedly well-informed philosopher is living under the illusion that he has read St. Thomas. But apart from that, would the fact that the world was eternal and that change and nature always were, nullify the argument of St. Thomas? On the contrary, St. Thomas insists that reason cannot prove that the world was created in time, and yet he holds to the existence of God, and his reason is that it is one thing to say that the universe existed eternally, from the chronological point of view, and another thing to say that it existed from all eternity from the ontological point of view. There is a world of difference between spatially imagining eternity and intellectually understanding it. The universe, says St. Thomas, might always have been, but it would always have been dependent on God. The time element has nothing to do with the causal element. There are some philosophers who think that by dwelling on time and millions of years, they do away with the necessity of a cause. This is just like saying that because the handle of a brush is sufficiently long, it will paint by itself. A racehorse is not dispensed from the necessity of a sire simply because it runs slowly. What is to be said of the statement? We can go back in thought from effect to cause indefinitely. An indefinite series is quite thinkable. Where there is no intrinsically dependent relation, one can go back indefinitely, and hence there is no necessity for a first cause. But the case is quite different where there is an intrinsic relation in the series. For example, I can imagine an infinite series of hammers producing the present bowl of a hammered brass, because the action of the 50th hammer does not depend upon the 49th, nor does the action of the second depend upon the first. But I cannot imagine an infinite series of grandfathers, and the reason is obvious. Someone started fatherhood, and without it there would never be a sonship, and that father is God, from whom all paternity is named. Again, we read in the same connection, but alas, the idea of creation has been displaced by evolution. Now, anyone who has ever read the first argument of St. Thomas knows that his first proof for the existence of God is the fact of evolution in the world. Evolution is only the method, or one of the methods, of creation. It tells you how things took place. Vis-a-vis, they unrolled like a carpet and made history. Creation tells why they took place, because someone made the carpet and gave it to the roll. I could tell a man how a watch was made, namely by slow making of pieces from one original metal. But after I explained that process, he could still ask, but who made it? Evolution, be it understood, no more excludes God than a self-made man excludes his mother. After having banished God from his cosmos, the author proceeds to draw his soul from his body. In this connection, he says that one of the arguments for the soul is the authority of the church, and we have the emphasis of neo-scholasticism. This statement means to imply that neo-scholastic philosophy is a philosophy of church authority, and Mr. Sellers alone does not share this error. This brings us to a point that needs stressing. The only condition for being a scholastic is not being a church member, but reasonable. And the only condition for being a neo-scholastic is being reasonable in the 20th century, when everyone else is unreasonable. Scholasticism is the heritage of common sense. Of any man with two well-formed lobes can be a scholastic and believe in a soul, even though he may not believe the authority of the church. Professor William McDougall does not accept the authority of the church, and yet he believes in a soul. Dr. Hans Driesch does not accept the authority of the church, but he does accept the authority of his reason and his science, and he believes in a soul. Aristotle believed in a soul many years before there was such a thing as church authority, and in the sense that Aristotle believed in the primacy of the intellect, he too was a scholastic. The existence of the soul is an object of reason and not faith alone. It hinges on the mere inability of chemical elements in combination to affect the unity of a living organism, and that is why St. Thomas begins his treatise on the soul with the treatment of the plant soul, then the animal soul, and finally the human soul, which is operations apart from the organism, and therefore is capable of existing apart from it. If there is no soul but only matter, which acts uniformly under impressions, why is it, for example, that a man gets a double reaction from the single stimulus? She is only a moonshiner's daughter, but I love her still. What affects the superior synthesis or this unification in actions, as Hans Driesch puts it, if there is only matter? There is here a synthesis transcending matter, and there is such a superior unification every time we laugh. Laughter is the possession of rational creatures, and this because, in virtue of their spiritual soul, they can see relations and judgments which mere irrational creatures cannot perceive. Religion can dispense with a belief in immortality, concludes the author. Yes, it can, and with that inglorious dispensation, every man will have no deeper relation to the future than to become as a stick of wood thrown into the bonfire of a combustible humanity to keep the flame of a consuming progress burning for the next generation. But for the life of me, I cannot see why a philosopher cannot admit the immortality of man when he admits the immortality of the cosmos. After these and similar arguments, the author concludes that tradition has failed. The belief in the church, the supernatural, redemption, and the like, all these have had their chance and failed. In a word, Christianity has failed. Such is the message of the first section of this book, which alone we are concerned here. Would it not be truer to say that Christianity has not failed, but that it has failed to be practiced? As for tradition, how can our boasted New World vision of things go on without it? Tradition is a memory, and humanity is its storehouse. And just as an individual cannot think present thoughts unless he draws upon the storehouse of his memory, so neither can society think unless it goes back to the treasure house of tradition, to draw from it those thoughts and reflections which will assist it to think out its problems. Can experience be any less valuable for society than it has been for man? This may be the reason for youths, but at least youths have memory. It is not the season of infancy. A world that despises tradition is a world that has lost its memory. And when memory goes, humanity is apt to forget where it's left its thinking cap, and it seems to have forgotten that very thing at this very moment. This all brings me to the light of the strange theory of progress, which inspires so much philosophical writing in our time. What is progress? Is it like a seed, or is it like a pendulum? Does it evolve organically, or does it swing mechanically from one extreme to another? Are the fruits of our own day the homogeneous evolution of a seed into a tree, or are they a heterogeneous change like that of a man blown to atoms? The question is very apropos in the light of those who say they will have nothing to do with Christianity in its present form because it has not the simplicity of the kingdom of God taught by our divine Lord. This is just like saying that a man will have nothing to do with the mustard tree because it presents none of the proportions of the mustard seed. If life is organic, then so is thought, and that means that progress consists in building on the past, not uprooting it. There must be some fixed goal or object before there can be progress, and it is impossible to say we are progressing if we continue to change the ideal. Modern philosophical progress has come to mean nothing more than that what one generation believes is true, the next generation will believe to be false. How truly this is borne out by an appeal to the history of thought of the last few hundred years. In the 18th century, when the science of Newton dominated thought and built a new universe under the feet of man, all thought was said to be deductive and mechanical, and all thinking was to be deductive from a simple principle, such as Newton's principle of gravitation. Wolff in Germany, Tyndall in England, Holbach and Voltaire in France all built their systems along these lines. But the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century scrapped it. Instead of the didactic poetry of a Pope, there was the romantic poetry of Wordsworth. Instead of the cold rationalism of Morgan and Chubb, there was the reeking sentimentalism of Rousseau and his command, "Do not reason. It is painful. Feel." It was then not the deductive reason of Newton, but sentimentalism which reigned supreme. But what the generation believed as true, the next believed as false, and then came scientism in the middle of the century, which resorted not to the deductive reason of Newton, but to the experimental inductive reason of Darwin and Huxley, and the positivistic reason of Comte. Science then was said to be omniscient. It could prove everything. It could even tell, thanks to an exact knowledge of the collocation of atoms, at what precise moment the cross would supplant the scepter on the dome of St. Sophia. But that notion spent itself, and progress came in the shape of a reaction against the mechanism of science by Bergson, and the omniscience of science by Poincare and Duhem. Today, philosophers say there is nothing absolute. Everything is relative. Nothing is determined. But everything is contingent. Nothing is true. Everything is approximate. Truth is not static, but ambulatory. But there are a few philosophers who have not made such progress, who are still living in the days of omniscience of science, and these are they who write that modern science has been the dissolvent of tradition and the cause of a new and certain knowledge. If one may venture to be a prophet, in the light of what has been happening in thought in the last 200 years, it would be safe to say that in the next 50 years we will probably believe in an atomic mechanical universe, and believe in it for unscientific reasons. The reaction will come, and Rousseau again will be enthroned on the altars of progress as its patron saint. There is a remote possibility that some men will see that truth is unchangeable like the multiplication table, and that great discovery, or it will be discovery by that time, will make them healthy rationalists once again. And with wonder and amazement, they will look back upon the Council of the Vatican's decision that reason can prove the existence of God, and wonder why Catholicism should ever have been called a mere religion of authority. In those days, men will discover reason, somewhat like that other man who went out from the shores of England in a rowboat and came back and discovered England. And that was Fulton Sheen, annihilating scientism and the modern sort of weird atheistic version of science that claims that, well, that always links science and progress. In progress, I mean ideological progress. I don't mean progress like going from incandescent light bulbs to LED light bulbs and the advancement of technology. I mean their vision of progress. The unmooring of humanity and culture from traditions. It's an interesting thing to reflect on here, especially if you know about Fulton Sheen's own role after Vatican II, where he declared himself a progressive. He did that. He became a full-throated supporter of a lot of the upheavals in the church after Vatican II. Although in the last couple of years of his life, when you watch some of his final conference talks he gave, you could see that there was definitely regret in his voice. You could see it in him, and the way he spoke about the changes in the church. Some buyer's remorse there, obviously, and it's why I'm not one of the traditionalists who's hostile to Fulton Sheen. It's just some of his writings from a certain period onward are, well, less useful than others, we'll say. But again, this was Fulton Sheen doing a book review, if you want to call it that, of a book by one of the famous atheists of his time, who has long since been forgotten by history. I'm curious what you thought of this, so let me know in the comments, please. And like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So does sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.